Okay, so you graduate from that high school as valedictorian, and then you go to Harvard. So essentially, I'm an immigrant myself. This is like every immigrant's dream.
Where did you come from?
I came from, well, it used to be the USSR at the time, but it's Ukraine now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, from Kiev, actually. I came over when I was 5.
Fascinating.
So I understand how big of a deal it is to go to a top university. So you essentially, I'm sure your parents were going crazy when you got accepted to Harvard.
They were, it's interesting. Yes, they were very proud, but it wasn't something that they were necessarily shooting for me to go to Ivy League school. I'll tell you what my parents' vision was for me growing up, which is they imagined that I would go to probably Ohio State or Case Western, which is another university in the state of Ohio where we grew up. They wanted me to go to medical school, have a stable career, right? I told you my dad faced layoffs at the GE plant. My mom was a psychiatrist, but that was at a point where there were a lot of changes in the reimbursement landscape. There wasn't a lot of necessarily career stability for somebody. She ended up going to see patients in nursing homes, and both of them were working really hard to really provide a basic middle-class upbringing to us. And so their view was, hey, if you become a doctor at a young age, but you're not saddled by debt when you graduate and you're able to make your own way for your family, that's how you achieve family stability. And one of the ways to do that was they had these programs where you could apply in high school where you would be admitted to med school automatically, but you just had an undergrad, and sometimes they would shorten the undergrad, which means it costs less, or you could even go on scholarship. So that was their mindset, is get a scholarship to have your undergrad covered, and then use the money that they had saved to help us cover some of undergrad, use that for med school, and do that at Ohio State or Case Western, get a scholarship and do that. Now, they also were very focused on academic success, and I did graduate at the top of my high school class, which was not something my parents expected. They were more focused on me getting into St. X High School, which was something that was far from obvious coming from the public school that I was in. But when I was graduating at the top of my class, look, they didn't want to restrict me either. So we did a big college tour where we did a drive. We didn't fly. All of our travel was relatively on a budget, but we would do the 14-hour drive from Cincinnati to the Northeast, and we saw different schools, and we did different tours at each one. And for some reason, I loved Harvard. I loved Harvard the best. I visited MIT. It was actually my dad's dream to go to MIT. He had gotten into MIT when he came to this country, but he ended up going to Cincinnati because that was the place he could find a job at GE, and he needed to make ends meet and be near his sister who lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana. But he wanted to take me to MIT, so he had me apply to MIT. I got in there. I got into Harvard. I got into Yale, but there was something about, it's kind of a stupid thing. You travel a campus, it depends on which student ends up giving you the tour. It's a stupid basis for basing your decision of where you go to college, but somehow the kid who was giving us that tour, he just seemed sharp, he was with it, he was funny, he had interesting interests. It seemed like Harvard was, even when I visited there at high school, and I can attest from having gone there at the time, a place that had a lot of weird people in a good way. But as I told you, I had grown accustomed to being in environments where I was surrounded by people who were a little bit different from me. There were people who had come from backgrounds that I thought were fascinating, interesting, people who were coming from the Upper East Side of Manhattan, not far from where we're having this conversation now, who had been multi-generational legacy admissions folks to Harvard, sons of billionaires in New York City, to people who had come from different backgrounds in other countries around the world. Some people who were musicians, some people who were mathematics geniuses. And so I thought that was interesting. I thought that was fascinating. And I said, that's where I want to go. I applied early to Harvard and MIT, got in. And my parents weren't necessarily like, yes, definitely go. But they're like, are you sure this is the way you want to go? Versus pursuing, a stable career. I also applied to Ohio State and Case Western in their medical program tracks. And so they were guarded but proud. And I made the decision I was going to go to Harvard and see what became of my career. And probably had a mindset to go in and study science and maybe become a doctor. That was the mindset my parents had me raised in, but quickly opened my eyes to other possibilities that I otherwise wouldn't have if I hadn't gone there.
Okay, so you go to Harvard and you start working with hedge funds while you're there. You ended up going to Yale, but from what I understand, by the time you get to Yale, you're already wealthy.
Yeah. So here's how that worked, is I started taking a genetics class in my first year, freshman year. Thought it was the most interesting class I had taken. Actually, the two classes I loved was one class was called Justice, which is really interesting. It was just about questions of, justice, right? The opening lecture starts with there's a trolley car going down the road and you're driving the trolley car and you see there's about one person you're definitely going to hit, and it's a child. And you have an option, though, to switch off the trolley track. But if you switch, you're going to switch to a track that has 5 people on the other side. What's the moral decision? Is it that you make the switch or not, right? It was opening lecture, so it drew me right in, ways that I hadn't really been challenged before. That class and my freshman year genetics class, which was just in the beginning of the genomics revolution, makes you just think about all of the things you take for granted about the way you live your life. Some of it is preordained, but not all of it. And we can actually understand how. So that was super interesting to me too, but I went the direction of being a biology major. But one of the things I learned is, and I think this is actually a broken feature of science education in the United States, they make you spend too much darn time in the lab. And that's not a bad thing. I don't mind spending time in the lab, but it's so slow. And a lot of it, the time horizons for getting an answer to a question in the lab, it's almost your mind stops working and you're really doing a form of manual work, which isn't a bad thing, but it's different than the thing that drew me to science in the first place. So it turns out there's a group of physics guys who had graduated from Harvard years ago, they were way older, graduated in the early 90s, that have founded this quantitative hedge fund that was dipping its toes into biotech investing. So they were trying to invest in the biotech sector. And they say, hey, maybe we want people who can help us understand the actual science to be able to make those investment decisions in medical products and in therapies in the future. So there was an internship. So I ended up taking an internship one time with one hedge fund. It was a wild story in its own right. I could tell you about that one. It was a fund called Amaranth. That ended up blowing up. I was 19 years old after my sophomore year, but that fund ended up later meeting catastrophe. And there's been books written about that one. It's a fun story. There was a poker tournament that summer. I never had played poker. You had professional poker players who were at Amaranth. I learned to play poker the day that I played the poker tournament on a boat cruise they hosted with a bunch of professional poker players. And it was a total fluke. I can't take any genius credit for this because I've since been not an exceptional poker player, pretty good, but not professional level. Ended up at 19 years old winning the poker tournament of that fund. And so that gained me some notoriety. They wanted to recruit me. But I felt like a better fit was joining this other fund in New York that maybe had some more academically former physics majors that had founded this quantitative hedge fund. And so I joined them after I graduated. So that was in 2007, right on the eve of the 2008 financial crisis, which was a fascinating time to get your first job right here in New York City, believe it or not. And so I got my job in the fall of 07. The 08 financial crisis hits right here in New York. And boy, that was a whirlwind. It was bad for pretty much nearly every major financial institution in New York. But I was actually getting my head start in biotech investing. And as a young analyst at the firm, I ended up having some early successes, right? Some bets that I'd recommended that were thoughtfully based on, analysis of the underlying science. Here's the risk, here's the reward, here's a portfolio of these bets we can make. And they started succeeding more often than they failed. And in my third year in, now I'm making real money, like money of a scale that my parents would have, like we're talking like added zeros on top of what my parents made on a combined basis. Nonetheless, weirdly enough, I still felt like there was this itch that I hadn't fully scratched, okay? I told you the two classes I liked were the genetics class and justice. And I was a science major all the way through college, and now here I am analyzing biotech on a day-to-day basis. But again, like one of the things for me is I never like steady, comfortable, cruising circumstances. And so I felt like I never scratched that itch at the intersection of law and political philosophy that I kind of had in my undergrad. And I had a seat at Yale Law School. I had applied, I had deferred it. They said, if you defer it one more year, you got to make a choice at this point. So I'm 3 years into my job. I sit down with my bosses at the hedge fund and say, hey, listen, it's been great. I appreciate it. I feel like my learning curve has started to flatten a little bit. So I'm going to go spend a few years in law school at Yale. And maybe I'll come back. I expect to come back, but I'm going to take a few years off and just scratch a different side of my brain's itch. And something interesting happened, and this would be, not that people out there are asking me for career advice, but if I were given some, it would be to just follow what you're passionate about, and good things tend to happen. They came back to me and said, hey, listen, how about this? Keep your job, Keep it as it is. You get to manage kind of your own little sleeve of your own portfolio effectively. That was different because if I had just stayed on the trajectory I was on, I would have had much less autonomy. You can do it out of New Haven. You can do it on your own terms when you want, and you keep your job. How about that? I said, that sounds fantastic, actually. So I ended up setting up shop in my own apartment in New Haven, ended up continuing to invest in biotech stocks based on scientific analysis, but also going to law school at the same time, having a lot of fun along the way. Yale Law School is an interesting place. And Harvard and Yale, they're not the same institutions today that they were back then. I can get back to that. But it was a lot of fun. My wife was in med school at the same time. She was living in the same apartment that I did. It's probably the most tangible thing that came out of it. And during those years in law school, right? So I made some money, right, before law school. But it was actually during those years in law school that, during my 3 years in law school, while doing the hedge fund thing on the side, while going to law school, while hiking around the foothills of the Berkshire Mountains and the Berkshires in northwestern Connecticut on weekends, while meeting my wife and hanging out with friends, I made $15 million during those 3 years. And this was back in, we're talking 2010 to 2013, which was a different version of what that number would look like in today's terms. That was awesome. And it was something that gave me great financial autonomy while doing something I was passionate about. But then when I graduated from law school, I kind of have the same problem where I like pursuing a lot of different interests. So I moved to New York City. I got my job at the hedge fund, but I don't have law school anymore. And I kind of have this itch again to fill that spare time. And so not far from where we are right now, there was this place called the American Comedy Institute. They might still have it for all I know. They probably do. A lot of stand-up comedians who come to get a head start in New York City go there. I decided to give it a try. Went through that in my spare time, do that in the evenings, and tried my hand at stand-up comedy, which was, I would say, not a disaster, but it was not excellent. I'm going to admit that. I'm going to admit that openly. I actually ran into a comedian last night, believe it or not, the event I was in. He was walking into the hotel. I respect the hell out of what those people are doing. It's hard work. I did about 10 shows, but it was about a reflection for me to say, all right, man, what the heck are you doing? Clearly, your learning curve flattened. You went to law school. You came back. Yes, I loved working at the hedge fund up to a certain extent, but I clearly had bottled up in me a desire to do more. But the one thing I took up from stand-up comedy was the habit of anywhere you go, they teach you, take a notebook and write down something when it annoys the hell out of you. Just write it down in your notebook. And then go back and you can figure out what they call the funny in it, all right? And believe it or not, it actually kind of works if you workshop it that way. I was doing it differently though. I was taking my notebook around even in the meetings that I would have with companies, this investment fund I'm working at. You're meeting with a bunch of biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies and healthcare companies. And I wrote down the things that annoyed the hell out of me about the way those companies were running their businesses. And I can tell you more about it if you're interested, but the long story short is what I wrote down in that notebook ended up becoming the business plan for the biotech company that I founded. And so in 2014, I formally left the fund where I worked, decided to start Roivant, the biotech company whose 10-year anniversary I just celebrated before I came here to chat with you, and ended up being the first truly major successful company that I founded.